"Don't talk to the old lady. She won't understand anyway," my daughter-in-law said, loud enough for the entire hotel lobby to hear. And in that moment, standing under the soft golden lights of a five-star resort I didn't even choose, I realized this trip was never meant for me. I smiled, of course. I always do. The marble floor beneath my shoes gleamed like a mirror, reflecting a version of me that looked smaller than I remembered, a woman with neatly set silver hair, a pale blue cardigan I had packed carefully for this trip, and hands folded politely in front of her as if she were waiting for permission to exist. The young clerk behind the counter hesitated, his eyes flickering from Ashley to me, unsure who he was supposed to acknowledge, and I gave him a gentle nod, the kind that says it's all right, even when it isn't. Daniel stood beside her, my son, my only child, scrolling through his phone as if none of this concerned him, as if I were just another guest checking in, not the woman who had once held his hand crossing every street, who had sat up through every fever, who had built a life around his needs. "We'll take the Ocean View Suite," Ashley continued, her voice smooth again, polished, as if the sharp edge from seconds ago had never existed, and I noticed how she angled her body slightly, just enough to block me from the counter, just enough to make it clear I wasn't part of the conversation. This was supposed to be a family vacation. That's what Daniel had said when he called me 3 weeks ago, his voice warm, almost nostalgic, telling me they wanted to take me somewhere special, somewhere I could relax after everything that had happened since Harold passed. 3 months. That's how long it had been since I buried my husband of 42 years, and I had allowed myself to believe this trip was their way of bringing me back into something that felt like family again. I remember standing in my kitchen when Daniel called, the late afternoon sunlight falling across the counter where I used to set 3 plates instead of 1, and thinking maybe this was the beginning of something softer, something kinder. I packed slowly, carefully, folding each piece of clothing as if it mattered, choosing outfits I thought Ashley would approve of, nothing too old-fashioned, nothing that might embarrass her in public, because I had learned, over the years, that her approval came with conditions I could never quite understand. The taxi ride from the airport had been quiet, the kind of silence that isn't peaceful but practiced, and Ashley spent most of it talking about spa reservations and dinner plans without once asking what I might like to do, while Daniel nodded along, occasionally glancing at me in the rearview mirror with a look I couldn't quite read anymore. Now, standing in that lobby, I understood something I hadn't wanted to admit before. This trip had a shape to it, a structure I hadn't been told about, and I was not placed at the center of it. The clerk handed Ashley the room keys, 2 sleek cards that disappeared quickly into her designer handbag, and for a brief moment, I wondered if there had been a third key, if there had ever been a place for me in whatever arrangements they had made before we arrived. "Let's go," Ashley said, already turning toward the elevators, and I followed, my steps measured, my expression calm, because there is a certain kind of dignity that comes from not reacting, from letting people believe they have already defined you. The elevator doors closed with a soft chime, enclosing the 3 of us in a mirrored box where I could see us from every angle. Ashley, poised and confident, Daniel, distant and distracted, and me, standing slightly behind them, as if I had learned my position long before this moment. I didn't ask about the room. I didn't ask where I would be sleeping or whether there would be space for me in the plans they had already made. Instead, I watched the numbers light up one by one as we rose higher, and I let the silence settle around us, thick and deliberate. Because I had learned something over the years, something Ashley had never quite noticed. People reveal everything in what they don't say, and I was beginning to see a pattern forming, quiet but unmistakable, like the first crack in glass that only becomes visible when the light hits it just right. And as the elevator climbed, I made a decision I didn't need to speak out loud. I would not interrupt. I would not question. I would simply watch and wait and let them show me exactly who they thought I was. The hallway outside the elevator was lined with soft beige carpet and framed ocean photographs that looked identical every few feet, the kind of design meant to feel calming, but somehow made everything feel interchangeable, like none of it really mattered. Ashley walked ahead without looking back, her heels clicking in a steady rhythm that set the pace for all of us, and Daniel followed just a step behind her, still glancing at his phone as if something there required more attention than the woman walking quietly behind him. I kept my hands folded around the strap of my handbag and took in the details instead, the faint scent of citrus in the air, the distant hum of an ice machine somewhere down the hall, the way the sunlight filtered in through the windows at the far end and stretched long shadows across the floor. We stopped at room 1824, and Ashley tapped the key card against the lock with practiced ease before pushing the door open and stepping inside without hesitation. Daniel followed her in, and for a brief second, I remained in the hallway, watching the door swing inward as if I needed to be invited, as if there was still a question about whether I belonged on the other side of that threshold. I stepped in quietly after them and took in the room, a spacious suite with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the ocean, the kind of place that would have made Harold pause and smile, his hand resting lightly on my back as he pointed out the horizon and said something simple like, "This is nice." There was one large bed in the center of the room, neatly made with crisp white linens, and a sitting area by the window with a couch and 2 armchairs arranged around a low glass table. Ashley set her bag down on the dresser and immediately began opening drawers, claiming space with quick, efficient movements, while Daniel dropped his suitcase near the closet and stretched his arms as if he had just arrived somewhere that belonged entirely to him. I stood near the entrance, still holding my bag, and waited. No one said anything about where I should put my things. No one mentioned another room, or a second key, or any arrangement that included me, in a way that felt intentional. Instead, Ashley glanced over her shoulder briefly and said, almost as an afterthought, "You can take the pull-out couch. It is comfortable enough," before turning back to her unpacking as if the matter was settled. I nodded, even though she was no longer looking at me, and walked slowly toward the window, setting my bag down beside the couch she had mentioned. The ocean stretched out endlessly beyond the glass, blue and steady and indifferent, waves rolling in with a rhythm that did not change no matter who was watching. I used to love the ocean. Harold and I would take weekend trips when Daniel was younger, packing sandwiches and a thermos of coffee, walking along the shore for miles without saying much because we did not need to. He always made sure I had the better view, the seat by the window, the side of the bed closest to the light. It was never something he announced or pointed out. It was simply how he moved through the world with me in it. Behind me, I could hear Ashley and Daniel discussing dinner reservations, spa appointments, a boat tour scheduled for the next morning, all of it decided in a language that did not include questions, only confirmations. I turned slightly, listening, noticing how Ashley listed the times and locations while Daniel agreed, occasionally adding a comment about what he was looking forward to, and not once did either of them pause to ask if I wanted to join or if any of it suited me. It was not loud. It was not cruel in the way people expect cruelty to be. It was quiet, efficient, almost polite in its certainty that I did not need to be considered. I sat down on the edge of the couch and placed my hands in my lap, feeling the fabric beneath my fingers, smooth and unfamiliar, and I let the moment settle around me without interruption. Because there was something about the way everything had been arranged, from the single room to the single plan, that felt too deliberate to be accidental, and I could sense it now more clearly than before, like a pattern just beginning to reveal itself, one that had been forming long before we ever arrived at this hotel. I woke before the others the next morning, not because I had anywhere to be, but because sleep had become something that visited lightly and left early, especially in unfamiliar places. And I lay there for a moment on the pull-out couch listening to the quiet hum of the room, the soft rhythm of the ocean beyond the glass, and the faint sound of Ashley's phone vibrating on the nightstand across the room before she reached over to silence it without opening her eyes. The light was just beginning to filter through the curtains, pale and cool, stretching across the floor in long, narrow lines, and I sat up slowly, careful not to make noise, as if I were a guest who needed to be mindful of the people who actually belonged there. I folded the thin blanket neatly, smoothing it with my hands out of habit, and placed the pillow back exactly where it had been, leaving no trace of where I had slept, because something in me resisted the idea of appearing as if I had taken up space. In the small kitchenette, I found a coffee maker and a few sealed packets arranged neatly on a tray, and I prepared a cup the way I always had, measured and quiet, watching the steam rise as the machine finished its cycle. Harold used to wake before me most days, especially after he retired, and he would stand in the kitchen in his robe, reading the newspaper while the coffee brewed, always pouring mine before I even asked, always remembering exactly how I liked it without needing to be reminded. I carried my cup to the window and sat in one of the armchairs, looking out at the water as the sky slowly shifted from gray to soft blue. And for a few minutes, there was a kind of peace in that moment, not because anything had changed, but because the world outside did not know anything about the quiet arrangements being made inside that room. Behind me, I could hear movement as Ashley got up, her footsteps quick and purposeful even in the early morning, followed by the soft sound of drawers opening and closing, the rustle of fabric as she selected something to wear, and then Daniel's voice, still heavy with sleep, asking what time the boat tour was scheduled. 9:30, Ashley replied, her tone already organized, already moving forward, and Daniel responded with a simple okay, as if the plan had always been clear, as if there had never been a question about who was included in it. I did not turn around. I did not ask if I should be ready by that time or whether there was a place for me on that boat. Instead, I took a slow sip of my coffee and watched the waves roll in, steady and unchanging, letting their rhythm fill the silence I chose to keep. A few minutes later, Ashley walked past me toward the bathroom, pausing just long enough to say, "We have a full day planned, so you might want to find something to do around here. Maybe the lobby has activities or something." Her voice light, almost helpful, as if she were offering a suggestion rather than drawing a boundary. I nodded slightly, though she was already moving away, and Daniel did not add anything, did not look up, did not question the way the day had been divided before it had even begun. I finished my coffee and set the cup down carefully on the table, aligning it with the edge as if precision could give me something solid to hold on to, and I let my gaze drift back out to the horizon, thinking about how easily a person could be present and yet entirely removed from what was happening around them. It was not a sudden realization. It was something quieter than that, something that settled in slowly, piece by piece, through small decisions and unspoken agreements, through the way plans were made and spaces were assigned and voices were directed away from you, as if you were no longer part of the conversation. And as I sat there, watching the light grow stronger across the water, I began to understand that this was not about a single moment in a hotel lobby or a single comment spoken too loudly. It was about a pattern that had been forming for a long time, one that I had chosen not to see until now. And once you see something clearly, it becomes very difficult to pretend that you do not. The hours after they left passed slowly, not in a way that felt restful, but in a way that stretched time thin, making every small sound and movement more noticeable than it should have been, and I found myself moving through the space carefully, almost deliberately, as if I were studying it rather than living in it. I walked through the suite once they were gone, not to explore but to observe, noticing how Ashley had arranged her things with precision, her clothing already hung neatly in the closet, her makeup laid out in perfect order on the dresser, each item placed as if it belonged exactly where it was, while Daniel's belongings were scattered more casually, a jacket draped over the back of a chair, his shoes left near the door, small signs of a comfort that came from knowing this space had been secured for him without question. I stood for a moment near the bed, looking at the indentation in the pillows, the subtle imprint of where they had slept, and I realized how clearly the room had been divided without anyone needing to explain it. There was their space, defined and unquestioned, and then there was the rest of it, the edges where I existed quietly, without disrupting anything. I turned away and walked toward the window again, drawn to the ocean not because it offered answers, but because it did not ask anything of me. The beach below had begun to fill with people, families setting up umbrellas, children running toward the water, couples walking side by side in a way that suggested ease, familiarity, something built over time rather than arranged in a single phone call. I watched them for a while, noticing how naturally they moved around one another, how space was shared without negotiation, and I tried to remember when that had last been true for me. It had not always been like this. There was a time when Daniel would call just to ask what I was doing, when he would show up unannounced with groceries because he knew I would forget something small but important, when holidays were planned with me, not around me. I can still picture him at 8 years old, standing in the kitchen with flour on his hands, insisting on helping me bake cookies even though he made more of a mess than anything else, and the way he would look up at me, waiting for approval, waiting to see if he had done something right. That boy had not disappeared all at once. He had faded gradually, replaced by someone who nodded instead of speaking, who deferred instead of deciding, who allowed silence to settle where there should have been questions. And Ashley, she had not been unkind in the beginning, not in a way that could be named clearly. It had been smaller than that, quieter, a series of adjustments that seemed reasonable at first, suggestions about how things could be done differently, how schedules could be rearranged, how traditions could evolve, until one day I realized that everything had shifted and I was no longer part of the structure I had helped build. I walked back to the couch and sat down, folding my hands again in my lap, feeling the weight of that realization settle more firmly now, not as a sudden shock, but as something that had been waiting patiently for me to acknowledge it. The room was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet than earlier, one that felt less like absence and more like clarity, and I found myself replaying small moments from the past, things I had dismissed or explained away at the time, now fitting together in a way that made them impossible to ignore. The missed invitations, the last-minute changes, the way conversations would shift slightly when I entered the room, all of it forming a pattern that had been there all along, just subtle enough to avoid confrontation, just quiet enough to be overlooked. I leaned back against the couch and closed my eyes for a moment, not out of exhaustion, but to steady my thoughts, to let them settle into something I could understand without reacting to it too quickly. Because there is a difference between realizing something and deciding what to do about it. And I was beginning to see that whatever this was, whatever had been set in motion long before this trip, it was not something that would reveal itself all at once, but something that would continue to unfold in small, deliberate ways if I was willing to pay attention. I did not leave the room immediately after that realization settled in, not because there was nowhere to go, but because something in me understood that rushing would only blur what was beginning to come into focus, and instead I moved slowly, picking up my handbag and stepping out into the hallway with the same quiet composure I had carried since the moment we arrived. The elevator ride down was empty this time, the mirrored walls reflecting only me, and for a brief moment I allowed myself to look directly at my own reflection without adjusting it, without softening it for anyone else. Noticing the lines that had deepened over the years, the steadiness in my eyes that had not been there when I was younger, when I still believed that being patient meant things would eventually return to how they once were. The lobby was busier now, filled with guests checking out or heading toward the restaurants. The low hum of conversation blending with the sound of rolling suitcases and distant music playing softly from somewhere near the bar, and I walked through it at an even pace, neither hurried nor hesitant, simply present. Near the concierge desk, a man in a dark suit was speaking with a couple about local excursions, his tone professional but warm, and when he noticed me standing nearby, he paused and offered a polite smile, asking if I needed any assistance. It was a simple question, the kind that is asked 100 times a day in places like this, but there was something in the way he said it that acknowledged me fully, not as an afterthought, not as someone standing behind someone else, but as a person worth addressing directly. I returned the smile and said that I was just looking for a quiet place to sit, and he gestured toward a small lounge area near the windows, explaining that it tended to be less crowded in the mornings. I thanked him and made my way over, choosing a seat that faced both the ocean and the lobby, a position that allowed me to see without being the center of anything. From there, I watched people come and go, noticing the small interactions that unfolded naturally between them, the way questions were asked and answered, the way attention shifted from one person to another without anyone being excluded, and it struck me how effortless it all seemed when there was mutual consideration. After a while, the same man approached again, this time holding a tablet, and asked if I was part of the Collins reservation, his tone still respectful, still measured. I nodded, and he glanced briefly at the screen before saying that there were multiple bookings under that name, including one for a private consultation scheduled later in the week. Something about estate planning services offered through one of the resort's partnered firms. He spoke casually, as if it were routine information, but the words settled differently in my mind, not because they were alarming on their own, but because of how they fit into the pattern I had already begun to see. Estate planning. A consultation that had not been mentioned to me. A reservation made under our family name without my knowledge. I thanked him again, keeping my voice steady, and said that I would check with my family about it, and he nodded politely before stepping away to assist another guest, leaving me sitting there with a new piece of information that did not feel accidental. I did not react outwardly. I did not reach for my phone or rush back upstairs. Instead, I sat there a little longer, letting the noise of the lobby continue around me, letting the ocean remain steady beyond the glass, and I allowed myself to consider the possibility that this trip had been arranged with more intention than I had been willing to admit. Because plans like that are not made casually. They are scheduled, coordinated, discussed in conversations that happen without certain people present. And as I sat there, hands resting calmly in my lap, I realized that I had just been given something important, not a confirmation, not yet, but a direction, a quiet indication of where I needed to pay closer attention. And for the first time since arriving, I felt something shift inside me, not anger, not hurt, but a kind of clarity that comes when the pieces begin to align in a way that can no longer be ignored. When I returned to the room later that afternoon, the sunlight had shifted, casting a warmer glow across the floor, and I could hear their voices before I even opened the door, low and controlled, the kind of conversation that stops the moment it senses an audience. I stepped inside quietly, not trying to conceal my presence, but not announcing it either, and as expected, the voices fell away almost instantly, replaced by a casual silence that felt too precise to be natural. Ashley was seated at the small table near the window, her tablet open in front of her, while Daniel stood nearby with his phone in his hand, both of them looking up at me, with expressions that settled too quickly into something neutral. "You are back early," Ashley said, her tone light, but there was a slight pause before the words, as if she had been adjusting them mid-thought. I nodded and set my handbag down in the same place as before, near the couch, careful, consistent, predictable, and I replied that I had just spent some time in the lobby, that it was quite pleasant in the morning. Daniel gave a small smile, the kind that does not quite reach the eyes, and asked if I had found anything interesting to do, and I told him that I had been observing, which seemed to satisfy him enough to look away again. I moved slowly through the room, not directly toward them, but toward the kitchenette, pouring myself a glass of water, giving them time to return to whatever it was they had been discussing, but they did not. Instead, Ashley closed her tablet with a soft click, a gesture that felt more final than necessary, and stood up, smoothing her dress as she did. "We were just going over the schedule for tomorrow," she said, though no one had asked, and I nodded again, as if that explanation fit easily into place. I took a sip of water and let the silence stretch just slightly, not enough to make it uncomfortable, but enough to allow something unspoken to settle into the space between us. "There is also something we should talk about while we are here," Ashley continued after a moment, her tone shifting just enough to signal that this was different, that this was part of a conversation that had already begun before I walked in. Daniel glanced at her, then at me, and for a brief second, I saw something flicker in his expression, something uncertain, something that might have been hesitation, but it passed quickly, replaced by the same quiet agreement I had come to recognize. "It is nothing urgent," he added, almost too quickly, as if to soften whatever was coming next. "Just something practical we thought would be easier to discuss in person." Practical. The word settled in my mind with a kind of weight that felt familiar now, not because of what it meant, but because of how it was used, as a way to frame decisions that had already been made, to present them as reasonable, necessary, beyond question. I set the glass down carefully and turned to face them fully for the first time since entering the room, not with confrontation, not with resistance, but with a calm attention that did not invite dismissal. "Of course," I said, my voice steady, even, giving them exactly what they expected to hear, and nothing more. Ashley smiled then, a small, controlled expression that suggested satisfaction, and she gestured toward the seating area, as if arranging a meeting rather than continuing a conversation. I walked over and sat down on the couch, the same place I had occupied since arriving, while they positioned themselves opposite me, Ashley in one of the armchairs and Daniel standing just behind her, slightly to the side, as if he had not quite decided where he belonged in this moment. The ocean continued its steady movement beyond the glass, unchanged, indifferent, and I could feel the shape of what was coming before a single word was spoken, not because it had been explained, but because all the pieces I had gathered since arriving were beginning to align in a way that left very little room for uncertainty. I folded my hands in my lap and waited, not with anticipation, but with a clarity that had taken time to form, and for the first time since this trip began, I understood that whatever they were about to say would not be the beginning of anything, but the confirmation of something that had already been set in motion long before I ever stepped into that hotel lobby. They did not rush into it, which somehow made it clearer that this conversation had been rehearsed, shaped in advance, softened at the edges so it would sound reasonable when spoken out loud. And Ashley was the one who began, her posture straight, her tone measured, as if she were presenting something carefully considered rather than something already decided. She spoke about the future first, not the present, about stability, about planning ahead, about making sure everything was structured in a way that would avoid complications later, and I listened without interrupting, not because I agreed, but because I wanted to hear how she would arrange the words, how she would position the idea so that it seemed inevitable. Daniel remained quiet at first, his presence more physical than verbal, standing slightly behind her with his hands loosely at his sides, and when he did speak, it was only to echo what she had already said, reinforcing it in a softer tone, as if his role was not to introduce the idea, but to make it feel acceptable. They spoke about my home, about the upkeep, about how difficult it must be for me now, living alone after Harold, how the responsibilities must feel heavier than before, and I could hear the careful balance in their voices, concern wrapped around suggestion leaning quietly toward conclusion. Ashley mentioned options, communities, places where everything would be taken care of, where I would not have to worry about maintenance or repairs, where there would be people my age, activities, support, and she spoke as if she were offering something generous, something thoughtful, something that had been arranged for my benefit. I nodded occasionally, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, allowing her to continue without resistance, because resistance would have shifted the tone, would have given them something to respond to, and I was not ready to do that yet. Then, almost seamlessly, she introduced the next part, the practical part, the reason this conversation had been scheduled, the consultation, the documents, the need to review everything together while we were here, while it was convenient, while it could all be handled efficiently. Estate planning. The words were spoken more directly now, less wrapped in softness, and Daniel stepped forward slightly, as if to support the transition, adding that it was just about making sure everything was clear, that there would be no confusion later, that it was simply the responsible thing to do. Responsible. Another word that carried weight without revealing intent. I looked at them both then, really looked, noticing how Ashley's expression remained composed, confident, controlled, while Daniel's eyes moved briefly, just for a second, not quite meeting mine before settling again. And in that small movement, I saw something that did not match the certainty of his words. It was not doubt exactly, but it was not conviction either. It was something in between, something quieter, something that suggested he had followed rather than led. I let the silence settle after they finished, not long enough to be uncomfortable, but long enough to make it clear that I had heard everything, that I was considering it, that I was not reacting in the way they might have expected. Because there are moments when speaking too quickly reveals more than it protects, and I had learned, over time, that silence can be its own kind of response, one that allows other people to fill the space, to reveal what they had not planned to say. Ashley shifted slightly in her seat, just a small adjustment, but enough to show that she was waiting, that she expected something from me now, agreement perhaps, or at least cooperation, and Daniel finally met my eyes, holding the gaze for a moment longer than before, as if searching for something he could recognize. I folded my hands together again, steady, composed, and I gave them the same calm expression I had carried since the beginning of this trip, the same quiet presence that had allowed them to move forward without interruption. That sounds very organized, I said evenly, my voice neither warm nor cold, simply present, and I watched the subtle shift in Ashley's posture as she interpreted that as acceptance, as progress, as confirmation that things were moving in the direction she had planned. But what she did not see, what neither of them saw, was that understanding something and agreeing to it are not the same, and in that moment, I was not deciding what to give them. I was deciding what to keep. I did not say anything more after that, and neither did they, because in their minds the conversation had already reached its conclusion, the outline had been presented, the response had been accepted, and all that remained was to follow through with what had been quietly arranged behind my back. Ashley was the first to stand, smoothing her dress again as if closing a meeting, her expression relaxed now, satisfied in a way that did not need to be spoken, and Daniel followed her lead, his movements slower, less certain, but still aligned with hers in the way that had become familiar to me. They began talking about dinner reservations again, about what time they should leave, about whether they should dress up or keep it casual, their voices returning to that easy rhythm that comes when there is no longer anything to negotiate. And I remained seated on the couch, my hands still folded, my posture unchanged, as if I had not just been asked to reconsider the shape of my entire life in the span of a single conversation. The ocean outside continued its steady motion, unchanged, and I let my eyes rest there for a moment, not because it offered comfort, but because it reminded me that not everything shifts just because people decide it should. After a while, I stood up quietly and moved toward my handbag, opening it with the same careful movements I had used all day, and I took out my phone, not in a hurried way, not in a way that would draw attention, but simply as someone checking the time, or a message, or something ordinary. Ashley glanced at me briefly, then looked away again, already certain that there was nothing I could do that would disrupt what she had set in motion, and that certainty was what allowed me to act without being questioned. I stepped slightly toward the window, turning just enough to give myself a small measure of privacy, and I scrolled through my contacts until I found the name I had not needed to call in years, not because it was unimportant, but because it had always been there, steady, unchanged, waiting for the moment it might be needed. I did not hesitate. I did not overthink it. I simply pressed the call button and held the phone to my ear, listening to the quiet ring on the other end, each tone measured, deliberate, until a familiar voice answered, calm, professional, exactly as I remembered. I spoke softly, keeping my words simple, direct, asking if he might be available to review some documents with me while I was in town, mentioning the consultation that had been scheduled under my family name. And there was a brief pause before he responded, a pause that told me he understood more than I had said. We arranged a time, a place, details that fit neatly into the space that had already been created, and when I ended the call, I placed the phone back into my bag without any change in my expression. Behind me, Ashley and Daniel continued their conversation, unaware, uninterrupted, still moving forward along the path they believed had been secured. I returned to the couch and sat down again, folding my hands once more, the same posture, the same calm, the same quiet presence they had come to rely on, and I let the room settle back into its earlier rhythm. Because some decisions do not need to be announced. Some shifts happen long before anyone else realizes they have begun. And as I sat there, listening to the distant sound of the waves and the closer sound of voices that no longer included me, I understood that this was no longer about what they expected me to do. It was about what I had already decided not to do. The next morning arrived with the same quiet light, but something had shifted in the way I moved through it, not outwardly, not in any way they would notice, but internally, in the steady certainty that had replaced the hesitation I once carried. Ashley was already dressed, reviewing something on her tablet, while Daniel stood near the window, staring out at the ocean as if he were searching for something he could not name, and neither of them looked up when I gathered my things, not because they were unaware, but because they had already decided what mattered and what did not. "We have the consultation at 10, Ashley said, her voice calm, efficient, as if reading from a schedule that had been finalized long before I ever saw it, and Daniel nodded in agreement, adding that it would not take long, that it was just a formality, something simple to make sure everything was handled properly. I nodded once, the same quiet acknowledgement they had come to expect, and followed them out of the room, walking beside them but not within their conversation, the distance between us measured not in steps, but in understanding. The meeting room was on a lower floor, smaller than I expected, with a polished table, 3 chairs, and a large window that let in more light than warmth. And when we entered, the man from the lobby was already there, standing beside another man I recognized immediately, not because I had seen him recently, but because some people do not change in the ways that matter. He turned when we walked in, his expression composed, professional, but there was a brief moment, just a flicker, when his eyes met mine, and something unspoken passed between us, something that did not need to be explained. Ashley paused slightly, just for a second, not long enough to draw attention, but long enough for me to see that this was not what she had expected, and Daniel's posture shifted beside her, his confidence no longer as steady as it had been in the room upstairs. "I thought we would be meeting with the resort consultant," Ashley said, her tone still controlled, but there was a question beneath it now, something less certain than before, and the man beside me spoke calmly, explaining that he had been asked to join at my request, that it was important for all parties to have a clear understanding of any decisions being discussed. I took my seat without hesitation, placing my hands lightly on the table, the same steady posture I had carried since the beginning, and I looked at them both, not with accusation, not with anger, but with a clarity that had taken time to form and could no longer be undone. The documents were placed on the table, neatly arranged, prepared, but now they were no longer being presented to someone who did not understand them. And as the conversation began, the tone shifted, subtly at first, then more noticeably, as questions were asked that had not been part of the original plan, as explanations were required where assumptions had once been enough. Ashley's composure remained, but it tightened, small changes in her expression revealing that the structure she had built was no longer as stable as she had believed, and Daniel, for the first time since we arrived, spoke less, listening more, his gaze moving between me and the man beside me, as if trying to reconcile something that no longer fit together as neatly as it once had. I did not raise my voice. I did not interrupt. I simply participated calmly, directly, ensuring that every detail was addressed, every implication understood, and when the conversation reached its natural end, there was no need for confrontation, no need for final words that would attempt to define what had already been revealed. I stood, gathering my things with the same measured movements, and I looked at them one last time, not as someone seeking approval or understanding, but as someone who had finally stepped out of a role that had been assigned without her consent. "I will be making my own arrangements moving forward," I said quietly, my voice steady, leaving no room for interpretation, and without waiting for a response, I turned and walked toward the door, the sound of my steps soft against the floor, the ocean still visible through the window, unchanged, steady, exactly as it had been from the beginning.